been asked to kind of give an overview of the interactions between the land market, the housing market, and the mortgage market. House prices and land prices are obviously intimately linked, and if you wanted convincing of that, the pink line there is an index of house prices, the blue line is the index of land prices. What's driving that relationship is, well, one of the things that's driving that relationship is, of course, the way that land prices are bid up by developers. So the first thing a developer will do when they're deciding how much they're going to bid for a piece of land is obviously think about how much the finished houses are going to fetch on the open market. That's the top level here. Then they might think, okay, well, how much do we want? What do we want our profit margin to be? What's our contribution going to be to affordable housing and local infrastructure? What are we going to spend on the actual build itself? And whatever is left over is what they have left to bid for the land. So you can see already that, I mean, this is a highly sort of aggressively competitive market. So you can see already that it's the companies that tend to squeeze these elements that are going to end up winning that bid. And this image of Nick Toft-Toby himself, actually. So he'd probably explain this better than me. But you can already see that one thing that drives land prices up is, of course, when the planners themselves end up being flexible and giving in on insisting on getting their affordable housing provision and insisting on getting a contribution to infrastructure and don't maintain minimum decent quality build standards. But the other thing, and I think the more important thing that drives land prices is, as I mentioned before, what developers expect to be able to fetch on the open market for the houses. And that, as we all know, is determined by supply and demand in the housing market. Now, normally I would talk about the dysfunctions on both sides of this equation. I don't have time, obviously, in 5 minutes. So I'm going to focus on the demand side, because that is what is so frequently neglected. We're told over and over again that the reason we have a housing crisis is because of a shortage of houses. But actually, if you look at the data, the scale of the booms and busts we've seen, the timing of them, the geographical variation cannot be explained by shortages of housing. You have to look at what's going on the demand side. Demand is a function of the number of buyers that are seeking to buy houses. That's not just people who are seeking houses to live in, obviously, that's also people who are seeking an investment. The strength of preference, which is, an economist's term for the strength of desire to buy that house over buying some stocks and shares, for example. And the purchasing power that buyer has to back up their preference. Obviously, a preference to buy a house only becomes effective demand if you've got the money to back it up. These kinds of headlines would lead us to believe that the main thing driving demand is swarms of more people coming and wanting homes to live in. I would argue that that is really not the main thing. The two key shifts that have affected the inflation of demand are, the ones that there's quite a lot that I could say here, but the really key things that I think are important to stress are the way in which the way we think about houses has shifted in our imagination from somewhere to live to them being a financial asset. And you can see that it's evidenced, obviously, in the increase in buy-to-let investment, the increase in foreign investment, but also the willingness of ordinary people to bid, to take on debt that in other circumstances would be completely insane. They're taking on levels of debt because they're expecting their house to function like a financial asset, right? So there's that's taken place, and there's also a massive expansion in purchasing power that's taken place. So, and in fact, I just had an illustration of homes turning into financial assets. I have to walk past this car every day, and it drives me completely insane. I'm going to get a spray can out one of these days. Governments, I think, have been at best complicit in this shift of homes into being seen as financial assets, and at worst, I think they've actively encouraged that shift. And I'll come back to talk about that probably in the Q&A because I won't have time just now. But the real thing I want to stress here is the way in which easy mortgage credit has expanded the purchasing power in the housing market. Because if you think about it, you've got this bidding war going on. If that bidding war, if the amount of money to back up that bidding war was limited by existing savings, then it could only go so far, right? There'd be a limit. It would be limited by the amount of money that's already in circulation sitting in bank accounts. But of course, when most people buy a house, they're not relying only on their savings, they're relying on money loaned from banks. And as hopefully most of you in this room will understand now, when banks create a loan, they are creating brand new money that never existed before. So they are increasing aggregate purchasing power in the housing market. Now, from the 1980s, the willingness and ability of banks to create that money expanded really dramatically due to deregulation, changes in the structure of the banking sector, and innovation, principally something called securitization, which, again, I'm very happy to talk about in more detail if we've got time in the Q&A. But the upshot of those processes is a few things happened. One is that interest rates dropped really, really dramatically from the mid-90s. The riskiness, the willingness of banks to extend risky loans increased. So this is the loan-to-income ratios, the percentage of mortgages lent at different loan-to-income ratios. The loan-to-income ratio is like, here's the size of the loan, and here's the size of the income of the borrower. A higher loan-to-income ratio is obviously more risky from the point of view of the bank. So we saw lots more of that risky lending. And the upshot of both of that is, of course, a massive increase in the amount of money being pushed into the housing market. And so, I mean, one of the things that I find slightly, this graph is showing gross mortgage lending. And one of the things I find quite startling and alarming is that we're back up almost at the levels of gross bank lending that we had before the financial crisis. I could talk a little bit about why that lending has not dried up as much as you might expect it to have. One of the key reasons is that the buy-to-let lending has been unaffected by these new affordability tests that everybody else has to meet. So buy-to-let lenders, borrowers can still get interest-only mortgages, whereas the rest of us aren't really generally able to do that. So we've had a 40% increase in buy-to-let lending since the crash, only a 2% increase in everybody else's lending. So the thing, just before I get a second gong, I'm sure it's coming in a minute, the thing that I think is so problematic about this is the feedbacks that happen between bank lending and speculative behavior and land prices. I'll stop there, but I'll have more to say about that later. Okay, great.